Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you to our hosts, Verso Books. So we're in the Verso office. But we're here to talk about a book from Grace Blakely. It's put out by Repeater called Stolen: How to Save the World from Financialisation. And I got the chance to read this book. I even gave it a blurb. Oh, thank God it's still on it's on the back of the book. I looked at first and I didn't see it, and then I'm like, ugh, I must have not given a good enough blurb. And it's a really accessible book. And normally, when I hear that someone's writing about economics, I just kind of read the abstracts. You know, I trust people's arguments. I read the introductions of economics commentators writing, and then I kind of skim over all the details, and I just pick the ones I like the most and just assume that their arguments are right, skip tables and graphs and things like that. But this is really an accessible book, and I think it's a sign that the left is moving in the right direction, that the left is now thinking about economics and thinking about politics and thinking about power. Obviously, there's a huge general election next month in the UK, and Grace is, beyond just the writer of this book and an economic commentator at The New Statesman, she's really at the forefront of this effort and of a new wave of really exciting commentators on the British Labour left who've been making compelling arguments and making it directed at a mainstream audience, to the point that even the most conservative, the most Blairite figures at the BBC and other outlets are forced to put them on and air their views. Though obviously, if Corbyn has the loyal support of, 1/3 plus, hopefully more, of the British electorate, obviously we don't get 1/3 of the time, but it's really a far cry from where things were 5 years ago. So to begin with, I guess we're going to have a conversation for maybe 40 minutes or so, then we'll turn it to Q&A. To begin with, though, I think it would be nice if you could lay out some of the kind of core arguments of your book. So maybe one good place to start would be, how did it go wrong? We had, in this post-war period, rising economic growth combined with really incredible social democratic transformations across much of the advanced capitalist world. We got very little of it in the US, of course, along with electoral success for labor-backed parties. Obviously, not ones as radical as we would want, but real steady electoral success. And then all of a sudden, this regime, accumulation regime that's working up until the 1970s just hits the skids. And often we understand this breakdown as being a purely political phenomenon. Like, we had some cowardly social democrats get elected and then turn to the right, or we had Milton Friedman and the Chicago School dream up a new scheme, or whatever else. But you present a kind of a very different analysis for what happened in your book. So I was wondering if you could explain kind of what went wrong starting in the 1970s.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. It was lovely. And yes, Bhaskar is on the back of my book, which has been very helpful over here. So yeah, I guess the theory of change, of historical development that I put forward in the book is one that is centered around class power, based on the assumption that capitalist societies are all divided into labor and capital. What I describe it as in the book and when I go on the TV is people who live off work versus people who live off wealth. And I look at the kind of historical development of capitalism primarily in the UK, but also to an extent more globally, and particularly situate the UK context in line with the US context, and talk a little bit about kind of Anglo-American capitalism and how it's developed. But basically, the argument is that you have moments of kind of institutionalized stability, I suppose, in capitalist societies. And these give rise to different modes of accumulation, different types of growth regimes, but each of which, because they are ultimately capitalist systems, contain their own contradictions. So, you can chart several hundred years of capitalist history in this way. I kind of mainly look back over the last century or so, and look at, we had laissez-faire at the beginning of the century. That ultimately breaks down when you get the Great Depression, and the kind of decade and a half of crisis that follows that culminates in the Second World War. Following the Second World War, you have a rebalancing of power between those two classes. And that results from, the necessary expansion of the state as a result of the imperatives of conflict. It results from rising taxes on the rich. It results from the strengthening of the union movement engaged in kind of mass production. And you leave the Second World War with a society that is much more, in which kind of class power is much more balanced between people who live off work and people who live off wealth, with the crucial mediating force of a much more powerful state now. A state upon which capital is much more reliant, but upon which labor is also much more reliant as well. And so in the UK, in the US as well, that gives rise to this kind of social democratic order, what we refer to as kind of the golden age of capitalism. It's institutionalized globally as part of the Bretton Woods system, which again, consolidates this social democratic order as well as imperialism and kind of neocolonialism. Again, that's something we often don't touch on, is the extent to which that golden age of capitalism is premised upon imperialism in other parts of the world. But, broadly speaking, you have this fairly stable social democratic model supported by Bretton Woods internationally and a bunch of new institutions domestically. So in the UK, we have the NHS, the creation of the welfare state. In the US, you also have, the state playing a much more significant role in muting the ups and downs of the business cycle. It is a much more expansionist state. It spends much more money, etc. And you also have much more powerful unions. And the kind of relationship between labor and capital, between people who live off work and those who live off wealth, mediated by the state, is, the conflict that is inherent in that relationship becomes a little bit more muted during the post-war period because of these concessions, basically. The problem is, though, that because this is still, fundamentally a capitalist system, it's one based on private ownership of the means of production, the stuff we need to use to produce things, and the support of that system by the state, it still contains its own contradictions. It still contains that conflict between labor and capital. And for a while, that conflict remains latent because you have this period of stability. You have a new wave of globalization, again, supported by these Bretton Woods institutions, the massive development of the US multinational corporation, the rebuilding of Europe, etc. But as you get to the 1970s, you start to see a kind of decline in the profitability of many Anglo-American corporations alongside, rising competition from the rest of the world. And then you get the breakdown of Bretton Woods and the first oil price spike. And this kind of catalyzes a decade of economic and political crisis in the Western world, and particularly in Anglo-America. And effectively, that kind of model, which relied upon compromise between these fundamentally kind of contradictory class interests, starts to break down because there is less to go around, basically, because you have massive increases in inflation, you have lower profits. The bosses say we need to cut wages if we're going to maintain our profits. The workers say we need to maintain levels of wage growth if we're going to be able to survive. And so that latent class conflict that exists within all capitalist systems and kind of under the surface in social democracy kind of bursts out onto the national stage, and you get massive increases in kind of industrial disputes. You get, political and economic turmoil. In the UK, we end up having a 3-day week, a bailout from the IMF. And it is in that context of crisis, in that context of kind of the breakdown of the institutions that had supervised, social democracy, that had allowed capitalism to adapt, that you start to see a new attempt to transform and adapt capitalism to a new reality. And this new reality is one in which capital has become increasingly mobile. You see, the emergence of offshore Eurodollar markets. You see, obviously, the rise of the multinational corporation, increasing capital mobility. And we get an adaptation of the system based on, yes, some planning and strategizing and organizing by elements of capital and of, right-wing intellectuals around Montpellier, et cetera, but which basically adapts based on, the interests of what was then becoming the kind of dominant force, dominant power within capital, which is finance capital. So, Thatcher wins over here in 1979, Reagan wins in the US, and based on this rebalancing of power and based on this new set of ideas, I mean, both of those are kind of are equally important. They implement a set of policies that give rise to this new growth regime, this new kind of way of organizing the economy, which I call finance-led growth in the book.
So, particularly, how do you describe the role of new labor in this formation? So one way to look at it would be there's this new monetarist regime that comes in the 80s, driven by Thatcher, continued by Major. Then New Labor picks up on it and just says, we're just going to continue this regime, but unlike them, we're going to make sure that enough is taxed from this new growth regime that we can maintain the NHS, and we could even, do some small measures to end child poverty and do a few things on the side. And there's obviously another narrative that says that New Labor, in fact, especially kind of due to the policies of Gordon Brown and others, just sped up the process instead of just, so I guess it's a matter of emphasis. Is it a reconciliation with this order? Were they actively driving it and deepening it? How do we understand New Labor's role in this all?
I mean, I think it's both, right? In the sense that these people coming to power clearly had an idea of what they were doing that was much more in line with the first section. There was this sense, and it was partly just, the context in which they were taking power, which was this end of history moment, right? That the capitalism had won the great battle that had been waging between socialism and capitalism for decades, that there kind of was no alternative to the prevailing economic order, that history was over. And that things could only get better, as Blair famously put it. So there was a kind of almost millenarian sense at this time of the hegemony and dominance of capitalism that meant that you just couldn't challenge it. So clearly this is how I think New Labour probably justified its tilt to the right, basically, was that you can't challenge capitalism. Capitalism has won. There are no alternatives anymore. We have to just adapt to the system that we find ourselves in. And they thought, and the best thing we can do in this context is to redistribute the kind of returns from a fundamentally unfair system. Because obviously, under Thatcher and under Reagan in the US, inequality had increased dramatically. It had gone from, I think it was like 0.24 to 0.34 on the Gini in the UK over the course of about 10 years. So there was a growing sense of that injustice. We'd also in the UK had a big financial and housing crisis, which was in many ways a kind of mini precursor to 2008 at the end of the 1980s. There was a kind of sense that something needed to change. And Tony Benn famously said that the establishment decided that the kind of neoliberal project was safer in the hands of a strong Blair government and the weak Major government, Major being the person who took over from the Prime Minister who took over from Thatcher. So there was this sense that something needed to shift, and Blair and others assumed that what needed to happen was basically, for Labour to finally let go of its old commitment to socialism and accept the new realities and just actually work to make people's lives a little bit less terrible under capitalism. But there was also something deeper going on here, because as Labour Party becomes more and more detached from its social base, it becomes much more responsive to the interests of capital. And you can see how New Labour actually steps up the deregulatory agenda that had been taken forward by Thatcher. The FSA under Blair has this approach to financial regulation, which is light touch, which basically do whatever you want as long as it's not illegal. And this played a significant role in precipitating the crisis in the UK, particularly with regards to the kind of growth of the Royal Bank of Scotland. But New Labour actually managed to, I write in the book about a chapter about the financialisation of the state, and talk about how Blair and Brown, more successfully than any other kind of Tory prime ministers who weren't particularly interested in the state, managed to kind of transform the logic of how the state worked in line with, how financialization was impacting the rest of the economy as well. So basically, they managed to financialize the workings of the state. And they did this in a number of different ways. Firstly, through kind of the introduction of this idea of new public management, which attempts to kind of take market principles and apply them internally within the state. So getting kind of civil servants to compete with each other, rewarding them based on, very particular metrics, fostering this kind of market-based competitive culture within the state. But also, under Blair and Brown, what we termed the private financing initiatives, which are a subset of public-private partnerships, really took off. And you saw a huge amount of public spending being undertaken by private investors. So this is not just outsourcing where the state pays a company to provide the service. It was that the state would basically outsource everything from raising the money to developing the project, to building the thing, to managing the thing, to these giant consortia of investors, many of which were kind of, there were banks involved, there were big investment institutions involved, there were some corporations involved. Basically these projects generally failed. The idea being that you're introducing the discipline of the market to the provision of services, of infrastructure, but without any real competition, just with a state guaranteed payment to these basically monopolies that were able to kind of basically get a huge taxpayer subsidy for providing something that the government could clearly have just borrowed in order to invest in itself. And as a result, you've seen basically some of these projects are kind of 40+% more expensive than had they just been provided by the state. And this is another aspect. I talk a lot in the book about this idea of privatized Keynesianism. So we move from an adaptation of capitalism based on principles of Keynesianism, which is basically we need to stabilize the system because we keep getting these big crashes, and doing so means increasing government spending in order to mute the ups and downs of the business cycle. Privatized Keynesianism is based on the idea that if there's a shortage of demand, which is a classic Keynesian idea, you can account for that by expanding credit, basically, and kind of boosting asset prices. So when it comes to the individual, this is experienced as a kind of massive increase in debt levels, a massive increase in the ease with which you're able to get a mortgage and therefore buy a home, accompanied by obviously the privatization of our social housing stock in the UK, based on the idea that this is how you combat the falling wage growth that you see as a result of the kind of inequality that emerges from this system. And on a political idea as well, which is that if you can get people to take out debt in order to own things, you can turn them into mini capitalists because they will become property owners and they will therefore lend their support to the political and economic system and render it much more stable. And this idea of privatized Keynesianism also applies to the idea of private financing because, again, you're substituting private debt, private investment for what was something that was previously provided by the state.
So I messed up the sequencing of my questions because that leads perfectly into my fourth question, which you will hear in about 10 minutes. But going back to what you said before, you noted, you used the word finance capital. And I should say in the book, you are wary of drawing hard distinctions between kind of real and fictitious capital, or finance and kind of real productive capital, or in the language of everyone running for the Democratic primary right now, Wall Street and Main Street. So I guess, one, why are you wary of drawing too hard of a distinction? And if we are not drawing kind of this hard distinction, what's unique about this new finance capital, particularly in its new form? Because when I think about what finance is, I think about, well, most of capitalism is about the production of commodities and at the point of production. And obviously, to expand production, capitalists who make their money off not stealing wealth, but exploiting labor are going to use various financial mechanisms, but to expand production. But fundamentally, it's all about expanding this commodity production. But you I guess, suggest that something slightly different is happening now.
Well, yeah, I mean, the reason that I focus particularly on financialization is that it has impacted the political economies of the US and the UK. And that isn't to say that like Anglo-American capitalism, under which you previously had companies that would produce commodities. They have now disappeared, and you just have this mode of accumulation that's purely driven by finance. That's, in fact, exactly what I resist saying in the book. I say that, all forms of activity have become financialized. And the reason that this is able to happen is, of course, because, finance is not some ethereal activity that sits completely outside of commodities production. It's intimately linked to commodities production. So if our economies have become financialized, then where's the exploitation occurring? And obviously, you have to look at this from the perspective of the world system, right? Because, the new wave of globalization that we had in the 1980s, which was kind of financial globalization, facilitated basically the offshoring of a huge amount of production to the global south, hyper-exploitation of workers in the global south, and the reshoring of many of those profits, often via tax havens or whatever, to investors, corporations, governments in the global north that then had this massive surplus to play with, right? So the distinction between that hyper-exploited set of workers in the imperialist periphery and the kind of, I don't necessarily like this term, but labor aristocracy, the less exploited labor in the global north, and the dynamics that link those two groups are what make talking about financialization important. Because for a long time, the reason that we had this kind of millenarian moment where we did think, well, many on the left even thought that history was over, capitalism had won, socialism was dead, was based upon the very unique conditions created by finance-led growth, which was basically production. And this applies more to the UK actually than the US, because manufacturing actually declined substantially more in the UK than it did in the US. Production being offshored, but the profits from production staying in the hands largely of capitalists based in the imperial core, and also a new avenue for imperialism that was less explored by Lenin when he talks about kind of foreign direct investment and the reshoring of profits, which is that even the profits generated in the periphery end up being sucked back into the core via this network of tax havens through capital mobility, and through those kind of financial networks that develop during that period. But basically, like financialization at the level of the global economy, financial globalization, makes extraction from periphery to core easier because capital can flow much more quickly all around the world. This was I argue that the central underpinning feature that facilitates financialization and financial globalization is capital mobility. This was the central demand of, the Mont Pelerin Society. It was one of the first things that Thatcher does when she comes to power is remove restrictions on capital mobility. It's the central demand of all international economic institutions when they go into, various economies and lend in exchange for concessions. It's always open up your markets to capital mobility. And it's because this, facilitates extraction, imperialism, whatever, and allows for the generation of, accompanied by, as well, the way in which this process of kind of financial globalization also facilitates the emergence of monopolies, right? So these two factors, like rising capital mobility, the emergence of these huge monopolies in the global south, generate large pools of capital, like walls of money, I suppose, that are looking for some form of outlet, some form of investment. And this is kind of what drives financialization throughout most of the global north, in the sense that these pools of capital are often used in these, basically to expand ownership by the people that already own most of the stuff. It allows for, on top of the exploitation that is already taking place at the level of the world system, and also, within each of these individual economies, which also do still continue to produce stuff as well, another layer of exploitation on top of that, which is that a tiny number of people are able to monopolize ownership of everything, of all the things that we need to survive, and as well as, housing, most of these assets, also the credit system that we are now increasingly relying on because of this regime of privatized Keynesianism. It adds a kind of another layer of extraction on top of that. And the reason it matters is because that kind of model that ends up taking place in Anglo-America is uniquely unproductive in terms of those specific economies, right? It starts to undermine what made finance-led growth work, which was the ability to kind of protect a class of workers within the global north and make them think that they were just like capitalists rather than like workers, and therefore had a stake in the system as it stands. Because it starts to, it undercuts demand because it reduces wages. It also discourages investment in production and instead replaces that deficient demand with debt, which works for a while. It worked for that period of finance-led growth when things seemed like, things could only get better. But when it stops working, it really stops working. And then you end up in a situation where not only do you have massive debt overhangs for households and for corporations, but you just have the kind of bare bones of this model exposed, basically insufficient investment, lower wages, a lower labor share of national income. And kind of the response to that, based on the logic of the system as it exists in these economies, is to accelerate rates of exploitation. So, you end up having higher rents, more debt, the creation of ever more debt. This is what the kind of monetary system that we have at the moment is premised upon. And eventually, you reach a point where it becomes economically and politically unsustainable. It became obviously economically unsustainable a while ago, but I think we're reaching the point today where that model is rapidly becoming politically unsustainable as well, because the attempt to deliver a regime of privatized Keynesianism that could conceal the low levels of demand created by this model, accompanied by the attempt to smother over those class divides by creating a class of kind of mini capitalists, property owning middle earners, is not working anymore, right? We cannot create much more debt than we already have because people and companies are already so indebted. Young people cannot afford to buy homes most of the time, and dealing with that would require, any kind of really huge intervention in the housing market that would allow young people to be able to buy their own homes would require interventions to make housing a kind of human right rather than a financial asset, which would deprive people who own those assets of a lot of wealth and of investors of another avenue of accumulation. So you start getting these, big contradictions that were before concealed by debt. You can imagine those contradictions under the social democratic period being concealed by social democratic institutions. After that, concealed by debt. And that fix is gone. So we're in this moment of crisis, and, we don't know what's going to happen next.
So that account makes sense to me. I guess the only thing that I wouldn't say push back, because I'd be way too out of my depth to
Please do push back.
My specialties are like late 90s breakfast cereal and contemporary basketball. But I know
nothing about either of those things.
Okay, well, I will introduce you to Count Chocula at some point.
God,
it really will change your life. So now I forgot my question. But okay. So if you were to look at foreign direct investment as a form of imperialism, as a way to understand what's going on now, then how do we explain the fact that, okay, so in the core imperialist countries that, I call imperialist just because they commit acts of imperialism politically, abroad, you're seeing a decline in living standards, and you explained some of the reasons for that decline. Well, at the same time, the countries where this foreign direct investment is going to, like China, Brazil, obviously, these are countries where the money is being managed by strong states, or at least under the first Lula government, under the Chinese Communist Party, for all its faults, has overseen a regime in which millions have been lifted out of poverty. And in certain older cases, like Taiwan and South Korea, countries have been kind of elevated from at the bottom rung of this kind of world system to sitting kind of with the advanced capitalist countries. So I guess not to question the account, but rather, does it make sense to think of this as a classic imperialist relationship, if it seems that saying that might make it seem like a zero-sum game, when in fact it seems like the group that's having its living standards decline in a relative sense, though obviously they're still much richer than people in the global south, are in fact, British workers and not Chinese or Brazilian or Indian workers.
Well, I mean, China is a very interesting case. And I mean, I have a kind of an economic account of why it's exceptional, but perhaps not completely an account that would fit in with this kind of analysis of imperialism. But I mean, to an extent it does, right? Because the Chinese economy effectively pushed back against the dominant kind of Washington consensus institutions and ideology. The Chinese state refused to open up its economy to foreign direct investment. It has like large amounts of state ownership over, banks, corporations, etc., which has limited the extent to which foreign direct investment could come in. There is a lot of kind of homegrown Chinese capital, which it kind of subverts those imperialist relationships. And also, crucially, that kind of newer form of imperialism, which involves kind of the sucking out of profits that are generated in these countries to tax havens or asset markets in the global north, that hasn't applied either because, again, capital controls and state ownership. So the Chinese state has basically managed to push back against that logic of imperialism, and as a result, it has in many ways replicated a model of capitalist development that dependency theorists would have said no state after kind of, the US, the UK, whatever, would be able to do because of those relations of imperialism. But actually, China, because of its political importance, because of the, the size of its population, because of its peculiar historical trajectory, has managed to do that. But China is a very, very special case because if you look at the rest of the global economy, I mean, just as we had this idea in the global north that things could only get better, that was as much premised upon an idea of what was going on in the rest of the world as it was a domestic idea. We had this sense that, all the other countries in the world would catch up with the global north if they just imposed these policies. There would be a little bit of debt relief as part of the Jubilee debt campaigns, right? And then they would be able to kind of replicate these models and achieve the living standards that we see in the global north today. That, ever since the financial crisis, and arguably from before, has been completely denied to many of these states, right? So the financial crisis hit the global south. It did hit the global south. The financial crisis hit the whole world, right? So, the lower levels of demand in the global north and lower levels of demand in China mean kind of lower exports, and that's primarily how these countries generate growth in many parts of the global south. What changes that is the massive program of investment undertaken by China. China switches from a model of export-led growth to a model of investment-led growth, which is basically the government spending in order to boost the Chinese economy. The government spends huge amounts of money to get the Chinese economy going again after the financial crisis. That helps to boost commodity prices, shore up kind of demand in many of those global south countries, but that is, again, not the case anymore. And the extra kind of weight has been the fact that you've had really low interest rates in the global north, which has meant capital kind of flying out to all different corners of the world, seeking out returns. And as soon as you had a little increase in interest rates in the US, some of that capital comes flying out again. That's what's happening in Turkey, Argentina, many of these other countries that are experiencing debt distress right now, is capital coming out that has flooded in there as a result of low interest rates and very loose monetary policy. So, as much as the model is starting to crumble here in the US and the UK, it is also starting to crumble for all of those countries that were promised that if they just did what the IMF told them to do, they would achieve living standards on a par with the global north. And I think that has a lot to do with what's going on in Latin America at the moment, right? It's not just about a particular, set of crises that result from movements of capital. It's actually about, 10 years on from the financial crisis. In the same way that 10 years on from the financial crisis, wages in the UK have stagnated, the average US worker is just as badly off as he was in 1979. It's not as acute in the global south, but it's probably felt more acutely because of the expectations that existed pre-2008 and the fact that the integration of the global economy means that like living standards here seem so close yet so far. I think there's now an understanding, just as there's an understanding that things are not going to get better in the global north, there's an understanding amongst a lot of global south countries that things are not going to get better for them either. And those are kind of revolutionary conditions, I would argue. You're less likely to get massive transformations in the way the economy works and big revolutionary moments in the midst of crises because people are scared, right? You know, they expect things that will go back to normal. But when you have a decade of stagnation accompanied by, you know, an oncoming recession and the threat of climate breakdown, which is, by the way, the big issue for the global south, especially those low-lying nations, island nations, nations that are already subject to flooding, fires, etc. You know, that's when people start thinking, I'm going to benefit much more from a transformation of this economic model than I am from things remaining as they are.
Right, and there's been a dialing back of expectations where now neoliberals won't even say that they'll develop the global south to the levels of the global north, but rather their goal is the alleviation of extreme poverty, which they'll define as, you know, $2 a day or something, and that's a goal for sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, not, you know, the raising of standards.
And it's only going to happen if the private sector delivers the investment.
Yes.
You're not allowed to, like, borrow. God forbid the global south could borrow to alleviate extreme poverty.
Though individual people in the global south can borrow like microloans at 15% you know, interest. So I guess going hopefully to an optimistic note before we shift to Q&A, can you talk about the, I think you diagnosed very well the problem, but your book actually ends with, you know, a bit about what the solution is, and you don't shy away from saying that the solution is democratic socialism, and you discuss the Labor Manifesto, and obviously now there's a general election coming up in about 5 weeks, less than that, 4.5 weeks. So can you discuss the National Investment Bank idea and some of the other ideas particularly aimed at this, and where it falls short, or, you know, whether it's an actual real alternative?
Yeah, so the proposals outlined in the book are basically centered around this idea of rebalancing power away from people who live off wealth and towards people who live off work, right? So that the line in the book that gets repeated is a socialist government needs to take on the banks the way Thatcher/Reagan took on the unions. So not just using state power to implement a clever plan, clever policies, but actually using that power to remove the support that capital is relying on and remove the constraints that people face when it comes to organizing. So that kind of sets the proposals in two camps, one of which is kind of constraining the power of finance based on the insight that if you want to socialize ownership in a financialized economy, you've got to socialize the financial system. And the other is kind of empowering workers. So when it comes to like socializing finance, it's basically about constraining the power of private finance, so proper regulation, like limiting capital mobility being that big one also that facilitates imperialism, restricting credit creation, probably breaking up these banks, and then creating public alternatives in their place. So having proper public retail banking, a national investment bank, and I also argue for a people's asset manager, which would basically be a kind of democratic, socialized investor that would invest a kind of sovereign wealth fund type thing, and also that would control and invest people's pensions based on incentives that people would have to send their pension funds to this asset manager. And this thing would kind of be democratically governed. It would buy up equities and other assets in various areas of the economy with a mandate to support the goals of, say, the Green New Deal, as well as socializing ownership over the long term. So you can imagine it buying up equities or lending to companies like the green startups, technology companies, etc., which would both help deal with the pensions crisis that we have at the moment and also help to socialize ownership throughout the economy using fairly kind of standard tools that are already available to us, as well as, you know, resorting to nationalization, worker ownership, cooperative ownership when it's appropriate. So yeah, that's the kind of socializing finance section. There's a bunch of stuff as well about empowering working people. So that's things like a 4-day week, removing anti-union, anti-organizing legislation, Things like universal basic services, so everything that you need to survive being free or very cheap at the point of use. And yeah, that comes together like as a plan, basically, to get control of the state and use it to rebalance power from one group to another. I think Labour is getting there on this. We heard Ed Miliband the other day. He did a tweet about class war, which is, it shows that Ed Miliband has come a very, very long way, which is exciting. But I think, in terms of, we've got to understand what the Labour Party is, right? And historically, the Labour Party has not been a vehicle for socialist transformation. It's been the parliamentary representative of organised labour. And it has also, had in it various elements of what was formerly, the much bigger Liberal Party in the UK, and basically kind of Social Democrats. So the institutional architecture is not built to be responsive to a mass movement. And that means that at times, politicians and leaders, and particularly kind of the people making policy, can be a bit conservative, right? Because they know, they're told constantly by the media, this is all the problems that your policies are going to create, you're going too far, you're being too extreme, whatever, for perfectly understandable reasons. But obviously, as socialists, we know that when you pick these fights, we tend to win them, right? If we can get everyone talking about class politics, if we can get everyone pointing fingers at billionaires and saying, why should you exist, that is going to be a good thing, and a lot of people kind of think, oh, no, that's a bit too scary, we can't do that, it will piss off the billionaires, right? But, it is ultimately what helps socialists win elections, what historically has helped socialists win elections. So getting towards those more radical policies requires a much more democratic Labour Party. And we started to see this year at Labour Conference, because grassroots campaigns mobilised, organised, and ultimately passed a bunch of motions to deliver some really radical policy moves. So the Green New Deal, with a goal for decarbonisation by 2030, abolishing private schools, which is great. The 4-day week was in there. And this comes on top of a bunch of other policies that were confirmed last year, including the National Investment Bank, which, as it stands, isn't as radical as it could be, because it just lends to other banks, and that's at least partly because of EU law. We can talk about that another day. But the other thing as well is the inclusive ownership funds, which Bernie's now taken up over here, which is a potentially really great policy that actually does start getting us towards that goal of actually socializing ownership, as well as a kind of making the economy less extractive and unfair.
Right. So instead of just putting workers on a board, and like you have with co-determination in Germany and elsewhere, this would slowly give workers shares of their companies over time. So the board seats aren't just representational; it actually is rooted in equity. I mean, they're all capped at fairly low levels now in all these plans. Whereas in the old Swedish Meidner plan, they were meant to go all the way up to 100. But no wonder capitalists actually organize mass protests against that. So I guess I would ask you, it's hard with a live event with cameras and whatnot, but I would just ask you, like, what is the situation as far as how this election is leading up? Obviously, it's the beginning of a campaign. So Corbyn's behind in the polls, but that's quite normal for an opposition party to be behind in the polls at the beginning of a campaign, other than to gain ground over the course of a campaign. And this is what happened in 2017. But the key difference would seem to be that in 2017, the stance of the Labour Party was to respect the results of the referendum and shift attention to its very popular economic program. Now, obviously, that's not possible given how extreme the situation is and how rightly focused a lot of the British public is on Brexit. But is there a danger of losing kind of marginal seats in the north? Is there a danger of the message, the popular message of the economic program getting drowned out by just all the Brexit noise? Is there reason for pessimism? And obviously, needless to say, as a caveat, there's still plenty of time. And there's still things for us to do. There's a sign-up sheet over there to do phone banking and other things with Labor International to support the effort. So I don't want to be defeatist, but what's a realistic
I mean, I'm not going to be
where we are?
defeatist. I think we're going to win, right? I honestly do. Like, I really, really think we're going to win. And like going into this, there were a bunch of things to be worried about, right? So yes, this Brexit issue that potentially cuts across the class coalition that we'd want to build, because it tries to divide people based on openness, closedness, rural versus city, whatever, rather than allowing us to bring together this big group of people who live off work versus people who live off wealth. That was a worry. I've said for a long time that the only way to push back against that would be to have really, really radical policies that alienated everyone who would otherwise want to talk about Brexit and kind of mobilized our coalition. And we've done that pretty successfully. In terms of the actual electoral calculus, what we know now is that Boris Johnson's strategy, which is basically to try and do a kind of national left populism, so like a kind of, well, not like a national, almost like a left economic and right socially and fairly nationalist and xenophobic campaign that concedes some of the demands on NHS spending, that goes hard on things like criminal justice, basically that kind of gets rid of the austerity argument whilst also, committing to a very xenophobic, nationalistic, anti-migrant, and imperialist conception of British power, which, understandably appeals to many of the people who voted to leave the European Union. His plan was to do that and basically sweep up the Leave vote by being conservatives and therefore obviously continuing to gain support from wealthy southern people who voted to leave the European Union, but also by adding to that a coalition of Labour leavers, right? So by being conservative, you can rely on those conservative leavers. By kind of, giving over the argument on austerity, you could potentially sweep up some Labour leavers. What we know is that Labour leavers do not like the Tories. And it's not just a do not like the Tories as in I have a preference that they will not be in power. It's that many of these places were at the very, very, very sharp end of Thatcherism. They saw communities, families torn apart, left basically to rot over the last 40 years whilst London has boomed. And they have a visceral hatred of the Conservative Party. And that comes out in polling. What could happen, I think what the Tories were potentially banking on, is that these people could be persuaded to vote for the Brexit Party, which is basically the manifestation of that, what Johnson is attempting to create in the Tories, but encountering resistance from the more free market elements, which is left economically with a bunch of populist policies thrown in there, and extremely right wing on a bunch of social issues. And yeah, a lot of people could be persuaded to vote for the Brexit Party. But even then, the Brexit Party potentially takes more votes away from the Conservatives than it does from Labour, because actually the vast majority of people who voted Labour are in favour of Remain. Then there's the problem of potentially the Lib Dems. But again, many of those Lib Dem voters will be Tories from the South who are annoyed about the idea of Brexit because it potentially damages their economic interests. They're kind of wealthy homeowners with jobs and mortgages who probably end up voting for the Lib Dems because they don't like the idea of Brexit. So you have the Tories losing votes on both sides. Labour, yes, potentially losing some votes to the Brexit Party in some areas, some votes to the Lib Dems in other areas. But it's not nearly as much of a threat to them, this split, as it is to the Conservatives, because Labour's core vote still holds up, and actually they potentially, because of their current position, end up sweeping up a bunch of other tactical voters who want to stop this. So initially I was kind of worried. I was quite very worried that we would end up losing that coalition that we'd be seeking to build. But I think partly because of those electoral calculative reasons, but mainly because of the way in which the campaign has been conducted, which has been so oppositional. Like it's been proper class politics all the way from the beginning. Like from Corbyn announcing that his campaign was going to be all about like identifying the actual baddies, like pointing out and holding to account billionaires and being like, these people should not exist. They're evil, right? And yeah, I mean, that kind of can verge on moralism, but you know, he's done it in a way which really brings out those class divides and which encourages people to focus on and talk about what we haven't been talking about for the last 3 years, which is how shit everyone's lives are, how they are working longer for less pay, how young people can't afford to buy homes, how their rent is extortionately high, the cost of living is rising, the planet is literally burning and everyone's freaking out about that. And we're about to go into another recession. Like when you focus on basically the economic vandalism the Conservative Party has inflicted on the country over the last 10 years through austerity and the inherent contradictions of capitalism, which have led to the financial crisis, rising inequality, climate change, etc., the conversation shifts immediately back onto our terrain. And if we are fighting on our terms, if we are setting the terms of the debate and the Tories have come back and saying, no, you're all evil, you're all Stalinists, then we've won. The party that sets the terms of the debate is the party that wins the election. And actually pissing these people off works because they just repeat the message. If you say we're going to tax billionaires and a bunch of right-wing commentators go on TV and say the Labour Party is going to tax billionaires, it's going to be terrible, all the vast majority of people will hear is Labour's going to tax billionaires. And they'll think, that's great. I don't care if this like random posh guy on the TV thinks that that's a bad idea. So like the more controversial we are and the more radical we are, the more they amplify our message, the more our base amplifies our message, and the more likely it is that we end up having the kind of election that we want to have. And judging from the events of the last couple of days, it looks as though that might be where we end up.
Yeah, things are trending in the right direction, but I guess the fear is that even an election victory, which I think is a real possibility, would yield a minority government just because of the loss of Scotland and things that Corbyn couldn't undo. And then, then we're in the situation of having people with high hopes, but with a minority government that even with the best of intentions and honestly the best leadership, I think, of a social democratic party, ever maybe can't deliver. But
yeah,
I'm trying hard to end on a pessimistic note.
Let's focus on getting elected first. I mean, I think partly it's what we were talking about a second ago. Is like Corbyn getting elected, even just him getting elected, it just is a slap in the face to all those people who've been saying for the last 10 years, you can't elect a socialist. You can't even talk about socialism. People don't like socialism. They just immediately think of Venezuela and, it's going to crash the economy and, whatever. Immediately, you suddenly, an entirely new horizon of possibility opens up, not just to people in the UK, actually arguably more importantly, to people all around the world. And I mean, in the US as well. So getting elected would be a major thing. What happens next is, you're right, is big. And we are going to be going up against the power of the British state, the power of international capital. Like, it's going to be extremely tough. And it may be the case that on some issues, people are disappointed. I'm sure that it will be. But I don't think that, electing a Corbyn government means delivering socialism in one term. I mean, I think it's very important for a bunch of reasons, the international side of things, decarbonizing, which we need to start doing now if we're all not going to die. But the attempt to kind of rebalance power in society is something that has to take place over a longer horizon. And what it requires is just as much as kind of policy changes is, it's undoing that idea of capitalist realism that Mark Fisher talked about, which is this idea that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. As soon as it becomes possible to imagine the end of capitalism, as soon as people start thinking, shit, my life doesn't have to be this way anymore, you immediately start to build class consciousness and you immediately start to build a movement around which people can organize and start to demand much, much, much more. And that's really my hope, is actually that we are starting to see, everywhere you look, we're starting to see in the UK a much more self-confident, assertive, educated movement that is capable of not just organizing to resist, but organizing creatively to demand things and actually to demand a different world.
So let's get a couple questions, and I think we'll take rounds of 3 questions or so, then we'll have Grace do a response. And by the way, the book is for sale too for $10, which is a good deal. Yeah, very reasonable price. But does anyone have a question to start with? Okay, go ahead.
There's a mic coming, sorry.
Oh.
You talked about it in the beginning, but it was a general theme, which was like the institutionalized stability of capitalism. And I was wondering, so you said that during those moments, the contradictions are kind of muted, but in no way is that stability a product of recognizing some amount of the contradictions in capitalism, or is it completely like an avaricious like motive and just kind of a coincidence that there's this stability? If that question makes sense.
I think I get what you mean.
Should we take another one? Or we'll give you plenty of time to think, oh, here we go. Good Kaner comes through with a question.
Yeah, that's great. Whatever. Yeah, thanks very much. I was really interested, especially in your proposals that you mentioned towards the end about the, what a Corbyn government could or should do in the long run. I guess this is maybe a pessimistic question, but given the kind of the very real possibility of Corbyn winning but having a minority government, and the very real possibility of a capital strike at that point, like just concretely, what are the levers of power that he has to mess with that?
Yeah. So the first one, where does the kind of institutionalized stability come from? I suppose it results from an interaction between power relations and ideas, right? So the Keynesian consensus can be formed because you have a more equal balance of power in society, because you have an organized labor movement and an electoral project to represent them that ultimately ends up gaining control over the state. But also, there's a bunch of ideas that have been generated, and there is a kind of mutually supportive relationship between these two things, that having a sense of the power of these new ideas, mainly developed by Keynes, but also a bunch of other related economists, gives this labor movement, this Labour Party, a sense of what it can do. Coming into power and delivering those ideas then, makes them more viable, and you get this kind of, interaction between ideas and power that I think is what characterizes any moment of historical political change. In terms of I think you said what their motives are when these periods of stability come about. I mean, this is not something I focus on at all, and this is often a critique of, historians like to critique Marxists for being too functionalist. So analyzing things as they happen without looking in depth at the motives of the individual people that are making the decisions. What I found, less so when it comes to the Keynesian consensus, but definitely very much so when it comes to the rise of finance-led growth, is that Thatcher and the people around her were very conscious of what they were doing. They had deliberately created a plan to to destroy the country's labor movement, even if it meant literally attacking them on the ground, to deprive them of access to resources, and to properly empower this section of capital in its place. And the people who came up with those ideas were, if anything, even more conscious of that was what they were doing. So, it's not, you can't look at these things in a conspiratorial way, because it doesn't matter if a bunch of people have a load of good ideas about, how they can monopolize power in society. They don't get implemented unless the structures have changed, unless, you get to a situation where power structures are being rebalanced and the old institutions are broken down, so there is demand for a new settlement. But I definitely think that, the right especially tends to know what it's doing when it is using state power. I think that's more the case for Thatcher than it was for Reagan, because Reagan wasn't that smart, but he just had to follow what everyone else was telling him to do. So yeah, I think there's always an interaction there between structures and power and ideas, and the thing that bridges those two things, I guess, is human agency. Which is also why we have such great potential to kind of change things today, right? Because we're in another one of those moments where the old's broken down, the new's not born, power seems to be shifting, The economy seems to be like not functioning as well as it once did. And the difference between us winning and them winning is our agency, is our capacity to kind of mobilize and deliver the project that we want to see, as opposed to them doing theirs. The second question about capital flight. Yeah, I love this. This is a question I get asked literally every book talk. And this was always the question that I would ask at everyone else's book talks before I wrote mine. Because it is really important to think about the kind of levels of resistance that we will get upon getting control over the state, both in terms of capital strike and capital flight. So a slowdown of investment and also capital attempting to leave the country. Historically, this has been much more of a problem because you've had fixed exchange rates. So states have had to retain a certain amount of capital to maintain their exchange rate peg. If capital flees, you get a devaluation, which causes a whole bunch of problems. That's less the case today because we have moved entirely to fiat currencies. There is no pegging, which basically gives you a little bit more time. You're not reliant on having to have a bunch of money here in particular kinds of assets. Money can be created, money can be borrowed, and that is especially the case. It will especially be the case at like the point at which Labour comes to power, which is that we are in this context where government debt is very scarce. People are demanding safe assets. So, if the government does a big bond issuance, sure, bond yields might go up a bit, but ultimately the government of Germany is currently paying investors to hold its debt. The bond yields that we have at the moment are very, very low. So it's unlikely that we'll get into some sort of Mitterrand situation where bond yields spike because investors all sell off government bonds. Also, we've got the fact that, the central bank owns a third of outstanding government bonds. So, that's another thing. So I think, there are a lot of tools that can be used within powerful states in the capitalist core, particularly those that have control of their own currencies, and particularly those that are centers of finance, like the US and the UK. But that will not be enough, both because, those levers are there, but historically, Labour governments have tended to refuse to use them. Partly for fear of kind of spooking the horses, partly because, many times they've ended up being captured by those interests themselves, which is why it is so important for us to be building power on the streets, in our workplaces, in our communities, at the same time as we're trying to build power electorally. Because, there will be that pushback, and we need to have a movement there that's able to kind of push back against that.
Is there any more questions? We have time for maybe one or two. Okay. Oh, there we go. One.
Thank you, Grace. I have two questions. One around Brexit. Is Britain's membership in the EU, does that make your policies that you're advocating for sort of impossible to implement? And if so, what's the ideal Brexit deal that the left should be pursuing?
So, Brexit. There are a bunch of regulations that exist at the level of the European Union that militate against kind of socialist policies. So there is, the European Union is founded on those 4 freedoms, one of which is free movement of capital. And that is the foundational kind of thing that facilitates financialisation. It's, also... I'm not going to go into all the problems with the Eurozone, but that's a big issue. Alongside that, there's the problem of state aid rules, which basically kind of limit the extent to which the state is able to intervene in the economy when it's not used to solve market failures, basically. So at the moment, the 2017 manifesto is largely doable under EU state aid rules. There's that problem of the National Investment Bank, which... it has to be much more limited in form to fit with EU state aid rules, but you can still do it. It's when you start looking at anything more ambitious that the problems start to arise. So that idea of the People's Asset Manager, absolutely no way you could do that under EU state aid rules because you're directing capital in the economy. Controls on capital mobility, again, not something that you could do because it would break the 4 freedoms. Then again, I don't have a legalistic interpretation of the exercise of state power. I don't think that states are actually constrained by these rules. the only states that are constrained by the European Union's rules are the ones that are rule takers, right? So when Germany and France break the Stability and Growth Pact, they obviously don't get punished. But when, the southern European countries or the eastern ones do, then they do get punished because they are the ones that are having power exercised over them rather than exercising power themselves. The UK is a powerful entity in the European Union, but there would be, resistance to any attempt to do this stuff by the UK. Ultimately, that would probably come down to a battle, which would be you have to do X, Y, and Z policy, or you have to leave, at which point, we have this argument all over again, but on the terms that the left would want. We're being forced out because we're doing things that are too socialist. The other argument is that, somehow you manage to reform the European Union from within the inside, right? Which is what some people on the left are arguing for in the UK today. And again, because I don't have that kind of legalistic interpretation of how the EU works, I have a kind of political economic interpretation. I struggle to see a way in which the UK could exercise its power over the EU, over the Eurozone, the Germany and France that manage the Eurozone, in a way that would make it less neoliberal. And all you have to do is look at the latest round of appointments that have been made in the Council, the Parliament, etc., to see the direction of travel for the European Union, which is towards much more neoliberal policies. And that's obviously based upon the individual domestic directions of travel within the countries that comprise it. And it also has to do with the way in which the existence of the euro militates against socialist transformation, as we've seen obviously in the southern European countries, but also in the northern European countries where the left is, still not particularly strong. And again, that relates to a kind of mini form of imperialism when it comes to investment and financial flows. So there are a bunch of problems with the EU. I'm not going to say that, socialism would be impossible within the EU. I don't think that's true because, there is no real mechanism other than invading from these other countries to stop the UK, which is a sovereign state doing what it wants to do. But I will say, it will be a battle, and that will be a battle that will be waged in a bunch of other international institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, etc. And it's something that we need to be prepared for. This is where the question of internationalism becomes so much more important, because most of these institutions reinforce imperialism. And I think one of the most important things that socialist governments in the global north can do is undermine these imperialist institutions and start building up new ones. I've argued a lot in the past for the creation of kind of new international economic order, right? So based on an alliance between socialist states in the global north and states in the global south that are, like we could call it pushing back against neoliberalism, but it's actually just fighting for their survival, right? Because they need access to technology, to generic drugs, to lending in order to kind of mute the impact of climate change, all of these different things. You can imagine an alliance between those states and states in the global north, and there are a bunch of them. I know because I've done some work with UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, looking at how you could rewrite some of these rules. And there is a lot of appetite for it. And that could be really one of the most transformational things socialist governments in the global north could do, because you suddenly start removing the constraints that exist within the global south for those countries to start to move towards socialism, right? And those constraints are largely why we haven't seen much greater spreading of socialism throughout the global south, where you have this hyper-exploitation.
Well, I think that's a great place to end it on. I couldn't find it just now, but at the end of your book, there's a Tony Benn quote, and it's I think it's the one that's like, there are no final victories, just as if there's no final defeats. So I imagine the next year or so for both of us in the US or the UK will either have exhilarating victories, I hope exhilarating victories, or deflating defeats. But if we're socialists, and many of the people, everyone here is basically young, all of you are young. So, we're going to have to deal with this for a lifetime. So the ebbs and flows will be there. And in the meantime, we really need to train ourselves to be thinking about things, not just in a political, sense, but also really understanding economics as well as our class enemies do. So please start with doing your own personal act of economics and buy the book for $10. And anyway, thank you for coming, and thank you, Grace, for being here.
Thank you.